Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. I'm going to jump right in. Let's take off. The monarch butterfly. It's one of the greatest migratory tales in all of nature. From way up in Canada, millions of butterflies journey over 3,000 miles a year, all the way down to Mexico. And they go to the exact same place, year after year after year. Perhaps even more astonishingly, it's a place where none of them have ever been before. Now, there's several reserves in Mexico where trees offer warmth to these butterflies during the winter, and those trees disappear under a blanket of wings. Now, despite all of our scientific knowledge, we actually have no idea how these butterflies know where to go. Along the migratory journey, they mate, they give birth, and they die. Each butterfly actually only lives 7 or 8 months. So it's a different butterfly that makes it back to where its great-great-grandparents were. Now today, I'd like us to explore a migration of a different kind, the migration of our digital assets. Now, how is it in a world where nature so beautifully completes so many countless migrations that we still can't get our assets where they need to go? As our industry of DAM is now past its 20th year, how can we evolve into adulthood? How can we actually forge a path of best practices for the next generation? So David told you a bit about me and what I do. As he mentioned, I live up the river in Greenwich. My work is really focused on 3 areas. I do digital asset management strategy for lots of different organizations, often helping them choose solutions. I do a lot of data orchestration work. I like to use this word orchestration because it's not just designing data, it's making sure it's in the right place to begin with and it gets to the right place at the end of the day. And then I like to say I broadly do digital stewardship, and I help companies understand how to best use digital to foster their goals. This is just a sampling of some of the organizations I've worked with over the last 3 years. As David mentioned, I have this very interesting juxtaposition in my work with very big corporations who are selecting dams or doing dam strategy to working with some really wonderful cultural heritage institutions here in London, avidly working with the Museum of London and the Art Fund, which is the largest art charity here in the UK. And I also work with some organizations still in my hometown of Philadelphia, including the Symphony Orchestra there and the Children's Hospital. About 2 years ago, I wrote a book on DAM, so I have a copy of it here. I actually remembered to bring a copy. So I'll give it out to whoever asks me the toughest question over the next 2 days, if you'd like a copy of my book. And it's quite a tome, and it's really everything I learned about DAM over the last 12 years that I've been working in this industry. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about it. So that's me in the DAM world. So back to migration. Much of what I do as part of my work in the cultural heritage sector is I think about historical metadata. This painting is called The Parting Cheer. It hangs in the National Maritime Museum, about a 5-minute walk from my flat. And it's by someone called Henry Nelson O'Neill. Now, I just went and saw this just a few weeks ago as my mother was here for a visit and she wanted to visit the museum. And I really stood in front of this painting for quite a while. And I pondered how well it captures the long history of migration over the course of humanity. You see a lot of joy, you see a lot of tears, you see quite a bit of angst and pain. There's people really crying and sobbing in the photo, or in the painting. But most of all, what you see is a very daring nature of the people who are leaving, the painful loss of those who are left behind. I find that The Parting Cheer is almost an ironic title for this particular painting, as much like our asset and data migration, it doesn't really look or feel quite so cheery, does it? Like the many people who didn't make it across the oceans in olden times, our current and modern asset migrations often go terribly wrong, don't they? But our assets are on the move. We are moving our assets to new systems, be they second or third or fourth generation DAMs, and maybe even we're still trying to get things off of hard drives. But we're trying to reinvent our assets. We're trying to present them in many different ways, in many different capacity, in many different sizes, on many different channels. We're trying to do it quickly. We're trying to do it magically. We're trying to do it on the fly. We want to do it now. Right? We don't want to take all that time to cross the ocean, even though sometimes that's what we have to do. Right? But sometimes, like crossing a clipper in the 18th century, it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes new technologies. And there's a lot of discipline that's required. It takes a lot more than just buying a new tool. You know, that's an example here from Chili Publish. But I must say, you can't just buy a technology and have this happen, right? There's a lot of discipline, there's a lot of effort that needs to happen. So let me tell you a story from my personal migration. I feel like I know quite a bit about migration because about 18 months ago, I actually quit my job and packed 3 suitcases and moved to London and changed everything in my life. And that was pretty intense, as you can imagine. And when I came to London, one of my dear friends bought me an Amazon Echo. And I thought, well, this is great. I'm really excited. I have this new voice recognition technology, and I'll be able to stand in my kitchen and whip up soufflés and have it play music and tell me all these interesting things and read the news out to me every day. I was very excited. So I plugged it in, and I start talking to Alexa, and I would say, Alexa, play me some songs by Led Zeppelin, or play me some songs by some other band. And it spoke back to me, and it said, I'm sorry, I can't play anything by Led Zeppelin. And I would say, well, why is that? I have an Amazon Prime account. Should be fine. I get Amazon Unlimited Music. Should be fine. And I had actually already gone into my Amazon account. I had canceled my American Amazon account. I had set up a new account on amazon.co.uk, and it still didn't work. So finally, after struggling with this thing for probably 30, 45 minutes, couldn't figure out what happened, I called Amazon. And what did they tell me? They said, well, Amazon Music is actually a completely separate account. You have to go to your online music library, and you have to reassociate your entire music library to the UK instance of Amazon Music. Right? So even though I had bought, well, a friend had bought a new technology for me, and I had this fabulous new technology, it actually did not recognize my new context. Even though I had gone and moved my account to the UK Amazon from the American Amazon, it still didn't recognize my new context. I actually had to go, and I had to change the context of the data. I had to go to a special site that I have never been to before, the Amazon support person told me, and I had to basically say, okay, I'm changing my music library to the UK. 5 minutes later, no problem. My Echo played whatever I wanted, because now my music library was happily in the UK. But isn't that a little bit annoying, right? Isn't this what often happens, right? We buy technology, and even though I had made all of this contextual movement in my life, just buying the tool or the technology does not solve the migration problem. You need to consider the new context. You need to think about how the data, the accounts, and the users will all be affected by the change. But, of course, there's a lot of factors in play. So let's talk about migration. And again, I know everyone here is in a different state of moving their assets from one place or another. Even if you already have a DAM, you probably still have some stuff that's not in it. You probably still have some things that are on shared drives, etc. So what are the questions you should ask yourself? First, what to leave behind? What's really worth migrating? I had this personal question when I was leaving. I owned a big house in Philadelphia, and I said, well, what do I really need in my new context? Right? I went with 3 suitcases, and actually one of those suitcases was stuffed with my cookware, because that was something I really wanted. Right? But there was a whole bunch of things I didn't need. It's the same thing with digital assets. There's usually a lot of things you're not going to need in your new context. Right? You can actually occasionally move on without everything. What's your plan to archive the rest? What do you migrate? What are you really going to need in the future? What's going to be relevant in your new future? Also, think about metadata. We often think, oh, we need to migrate all the metadata. Well, maybe not, right? Maybe you don't need to move all that metadata. Maybe you need new structures. Maybe you need to think about the new context. And I would say the new context for metadata isn't just a new place, but it's also the customer. Right? We need to think more about metadata that's really about the customer. And thinking about how is the customer going to experience this particular asset? How do they want to use this particular asset? Much more than just what is this about, right? It's just as much about use in that new place, in that new context. When should you do it? This is also a very, very important question. I like to say, very serendipitously, I chose to move here when the pound tanked against the dollar, right? There's good moments, right, to migrate things, and there's good moments to move, right? But you're going to need to think from a system perspective. Should I run systems in parallel, right? Is there an on-off switch in the migration world? No, right? It happens over time. It's not an instantaneous thing. It might take you 10 to 12 months to migrate everything. You might need to run another system in parallel at the same time. You might need to leave that hard drive running in the same directory structure until people are trained in the new system and in the new taxonomy and in the new navigation schemes that they might have to use. And then finally, lastly, how do you drive adoption? This is perhaps the biggest challenge you're going to face. Right? If you're going to have a new system and you're going to migrate assets in that new system, how do you make it worth it? Right? How do you make sure that you're going to engage people in the destination and make sure that you enjoy and ensure that success? So this is sort of a migration roadmap, and it sounds very organizational and technical, but maybe we can take some more lessons from nature. What does nature teach us about migration?
Arctic terns have stubby legs, so they're clumsy on land. But in the sky, that's a different story.
It's a very elegant bird in the air. This is really a bird that's made for life in the sky.
And, says Karsten Eggevang, a researcher at the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources, Arctic terns put that flying ability to good use.
It conducts this extremely long migration.
A migration from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back every year. The birds fly across an incredible amount of our planet, and Eggevang wanted to know more about that journey, how they get from the very north to the very south, and where they stop along the way. So in July of 2007, Eggevang headed up to Sand Island off the coast of Greenland, right here. That's where he could find 1,000 breeding pairs of Arctic terns. His plan was to attach little geolocator bracelets to the legs of the birds to log their flight paths. But that was easier said than done.
The island we worked on is a very flat island in the middle of a big fjord, so there was absolutely no protection towards storms. So we had some really, really bad weather where our tents blew into the sea.
Wait, your tents blew into the sea? Didn't you need those tents to sleep?
Yeah, they'll get just devastated by the storms.
And if the cold and wet weren't enough, and the noise, they were also under attack.
The Arctic terns are very good at defending their colony, so they would attack us all the time from behind where you didn't notice them and pick us in the head with their really pointy beaks.
Eggevang managed to trap 50 Arctic terns and attach the bracelets to them. And within days, the birds took off in small flocks of 10 to 20 and began their migratory odyssey. To retrieve the data, Eggevang had to get those geolocators back, so he waited a whole year for the birds to return. And when they did,
we had to find the exact same individual that we marked the year before.
How did you find the birds again? You would look with binoculars in the sky?
We would look up in the air at several hundred birds at the same time and look for that one bird that would have a small lock on the leg. So that was really time-consuming.
Eggevang would track the bird back to its nest and set up that same trap to retrieve his geolocator.
Well, we are really far away into the Greenland wilderness, so we don't have all that much to celebrate with, apart from a bottle of whiskey. So we had a whiskey when we caught a bird.
All told, he tagged 10 birds and drank 10 shots of whiskey.
Metadata is hard. Metadata is a challenge. If you think your job is hard, imagine assigning metadata to the leg of an Arctic tern on a fjord in Greenland, right? But that's essentially what he's doing, right? So think twice before you complain about assigning metadata to your assets. Think of Mr. Eggevang there up on the fjord and everything he had to do to assign metadata to his birds. So there's a lot to be learned here, right? I know it's a little bit crazy when you think about these scientists, and it of course makes you admire these scientists for the work that they do in the name of science. But first, stop thinking that tracking your assets will be easy. It requires work, and metadata requires work. Metadata beacons attached to the legs of your assets is the only way that you'll know where they go and how to use them later. It's also the only way that downstream systems will know how to use them as well. It's absolutely vital. So what happens next? Well, you might expect that migration can happen fast, but like the Arctic tern, migration of assets and metadata is usually a very long and calculated journey.
He expected to find the birds would be in a hurry to get where they were going, but after leaving the breeding grounds, the birds spent a month hanging out in the middle of the North Atlantic.
This was completely unknown that the birds would do that.
Most of what's driving their migratory path is food, so they hang around spots where there are lots of small fish to eat, like this part of the Atlantic. They start flying south again in September.
So during the migration, this is the biggest opportunity you have. Doesn't matter if you're migrating from an old dam to a new dam, or your hard drives, or your own personal computer into a family shared photo archive, right? You have the opportunity to enrich your assets. You know, just like the Arctic terns, they hover in the places of nourishment, right, in the ocean. This is your chance as you move things. Migration is the time to make your assets all that they can be. So I like to use a concept from my colleague Brian Cross, who I work with through Claris IP, which is a firm out of New York that does digital asset management strategy and rights management. And he uses this concept of a metadata assembly line that I really like. So you got to think about, as you're migrating your assets and as you're moving your assets, how can you enrich them along the way? Well, administrative metadata is one idea, right? So this is where usually you have a DAM team, hopefully, people working in the system, or maybe you're outsourcing it with a managed service. And this is where you can bring in things like standards-based metadata. Hopefully you have a standards-based taxonomy and metadata schema that you have designed, or that you have hired consultants to design for you, that you can then really make sure that your assets are conforming to these standards. But then you can also use your DAM system to do some automated metadata extraction, things like EXIF, things like geographic data from the cameras today that are implicit within the photography that we're taking, or even technical data that comes in. Who created it? What kind of file is it? What's the size? What's the resolution, etc. Then you can think about descriptive metadata. And this is where things have gotten really interesting, I think, in the last couple of years. We can all write our own bulk descriptive metadata, but we also today can work with AI tools, right? We can work with auto-tagging technology. There's so many options now, and it continues to get better and better. And there's now this really wonderful sort of symbiosis that we can have with metadata teams working with AI tools, really, to refine and to teach technology to tag better. But again, has to be based on standards, and it has to be based on a very solid taxonomy that's really designed by human beings. Then you can think about product metadata, and this is something especially important, even if you're not necessarily a product company. If you're a museum, it might be metadata about objects. If you're a cultural heritage institution, it might be about whatever you're historically managing to then enhance again. And then finally, you need to have QA, right? See, everyone's taking pictures. I'm happy to provide this slide for everyone who's taking pictures. This is where you need to verify, right? It's very important to have a verification process. And I see the team from ICP sitting back there. We did a whole white paper on this last year where we talked about and wrote about these exact issues, where you can use AI, you can leverage AI, you can have a taxonomy, but you still have to have that point at the end where specifically a human being is verifying. Because later on down the line, a system is going to be making decisions on the fly to present something, a marketing automation tool, an e-commerce tool, a web content management tool, based on everything that you add to this asset, right? So it's got to be right. It's got to be right. You can't just leave it to the software to tag. And then we publish. So I have an example, and this example of AI that I think was first presented 2 years ago by Tom DeRitter from Style Labs in New York, and I still use this slide because I think it's a really good example. But this is the kind of auto-tagging results that you get from a picture of a sandwich, right? So you have this picture of a sandwich on a plate, and there's a lot of accurate terms in here, but the reason why verification is so important is because there are still errors, right? And part of what we learned with the ICP study last year was it was about 10 to 15% of inaccurate terms, right, that got tagged. And so, for example, dairy product is incorrect, right? There's no dairy on this. There's coleslaw that kind of maybe looks like it has sort of whitish dairy in it, but It doesn't, right? So we have to think about, as we start to use these symbiotic tools that we might work with, not just how accurate is it, but how likely is our type of content to be tagged accurately, right? Sometimes you have situations where a lot of your images might look the same, right? If you're going to tag all the images from an impressionist painting exhibition, it's going to be difficult to distinguish between Monet and Manet, right? You're not necessarily going to be able to do that with auto-tagging technology, but you might be able to recognize everything as impressionist paintings, right? So we have to start to think about what are the limits and what do we still need human beings to do. All right, so let's circle back to our terns and find out what happened to them, shall we?
And then something really surprising happening around equator.
There's a migratory divide, a split.
About half the bird would follow the coast of Africa, whereas the other half would cross the Atlantic and then follow the coast of South America. But even though the birds would be scattered all over the Atlantic Ocean, all of them came back to spend the winter in the Weddell Sea down at Antarctica, where they will find an iceberg and rest and just fish and eat throughout the winter.
Sounds like a nice place to spend the winter, hanging out on an Antarctic iceberg. But the important thing here is to think about the fact that the birds take different routes, and they enrich themselves in different ways and in different places along their journey. They rest, they continue to enrich themselves under the Antarctic sun. These creatures actually experience more daylight than any living creature on Earth. So it's the same thing that should happen with our assets, right? They might be enriched in different ways along the journey. They might be tagged by different people. They might pass through different systems and be enriched in different ways. But afterwards, what happens to the birds is that they move in tandem back to where they're headed.
And then within a week, all the birds take off to begin their northward return flight.
Instead of following the same routes as they did when they migrated south, they would pick a totally different S-shape pattern, flying towards Africa, crossing the equator around the 1st of May, and then reaching almost as far as the Caribbeans before they would start flying towards Greenland.
The birds were able to take advantage of a strong tailwind by taking this particular path, so they covered a lot of ground, over 300 miles per day.
It's like the birds were in a hurry to get back to the breeding grounds, and they more or less just went as fast as they could.
Here you can see the tracks from the birds that Egevang tagged. He can say something now about hotspots in the ocean, places that are especially rich in food not just for Arctic terns, but for other seabirds and marine mammals too. That can be helpful in deciding which parts of the ocean require extra conservation attention.
Coordinated motion is what this is about. When you think about which parts of the ocean need extra conservation attention so the terns can be fed, we can also think about where our assets should be focused to enrich themselves along the way. Be it metadata about how our customers interact with our assets, whether it be which assets drive the most sales, which assets are the most downloaded by our marketers, which ones are the most effective. This is how our assets must come together in a coordinated motion, well tagged, in an orchestrated pattern like an elegant flock of birds. The Arctic tern flies the equivalent of 3 times to the moon and back over the course of its life. Surely, you'd think we could make a similar effort, right, just to get our assets where they need to go. Conservation attention allows us to use our assets well today. It also helps us create the archives of tomorrow. Terns stop where there's food. They enrich themselves over the course of the migration, and we are the stewards for the habitat of our assets. In this case, it's not the journey so much that matters, it's the destination. So, the struggle is real. So you're going to encounter a lot of resistance, like the salmon trying to get back to their breeding ground. You encounter headwinds. This is like your struggle with management, isn't it? Against the current. Some days you'll come home, you'll feel like you hit a rock. You'll feel like you got injured. It's tough. It's tough. I understand. Some days I feel that way too. I often joke, being a consultant, I have all the influence but none of the power, right? So you're going to feel that way sometimes, some days. It's like swimming upstream. But the best salmon get back to the breeding ground. You have to have the same fortitude to justify your projects. You have to have a solid business case. You have to demonstrate ROI for the long haul. Otherwise, you won't get there. Migration has no on or off switch. It's an ongoing journey, and you also have to continue to make sure, as assets get created, that they're going to get back to where they belong. So I had to put up at least one technical slide here, and I find it amusing that vendors have their own sort of migration stories that they want to write for you. But you really have to be cautious. This is an example from Microsoft. I find this really amusing because in the top left, it's almost as if your DAM is on premise, you're still in the agrarian era, right? With this barn up there. But you have to think about, before you embark on a journey to migrate your assets into the cloud, which is one of the most common migrations that we have today, you have to ask yourself certain questions, right? Cloud is not a binary decision necessarily. It's not, I'm going to be on premise or am I going to be on the cloud. A lot of organizations, for security reasons or for the cost of storage reasons or whatever it might be, they actually decide to do different hybrid models, right? And so this path I enjoyed looking at because it shows options. It says you could do infrastructure as a service. It says you could do platform as a service. That's what Passville is and IaaSville is. Because there are many different flavors of the cloud, just like the different migratory paths of the bird, right? It's not a binary decision, right? So you need to think about what kinds of questions do I need to ask myself before I embark on this journey. Because you really don't want to wait until you're on the journey or afterwards to really figure out these very, very important technical details that need to be solved. So to wrap up, some migration tips and best practices. First, you want to determine a migration strategy, as I mentioned. What to migrate, what to archive. Metadata to keep, metadata to retire. You want to clean out the rot. This is an expression that I use a lot. Redundant, outdated, and trivial assets comes from my longtime friend Lisa Welchman, who's an expert in basically governance and data governance. And I love this term because it's something we don't do enough in our work. It's something we don't do enough in our life. It's something we don't do enough in our minds. Right? Clean out the rot. Right? So definitely do it in your life, with your assets in general. Right? And then understand the destination storage structure. Plan to map the old structure to the new. Right? This is also something else that's very important that we can't leave to artificial intelligence. We need to think about what is the new data structure that we need, how does it map from the old structure so that we get things in an optimal state. Finally, understand and plan for communications about system transitions and downtime. It still amazes me how people expect, well, if we buy a great system and it has a great taxonomy and intuitive navigation, we don't have to train anybody. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You always have to train people. You always have to communicate well. You always have to be clear. And then finally, you have to plan for validation and QA before rolling things out. And back to our butterflies to finish off.
Pues aquí el santuario tiene 20 años que está dando servicio al turismo. Por eso mismo, desde ese tiempo, ya no se ha tirado ningún árbol. Llevo como 10 años ya aquí dando servicio al turismo como guía, pues ahora sí que en lugar de mi papá, que él trabajaba aquí. La mariposa viaja 4.500 kilómetros desde Canadá aquí a estos bosques. Y en el bosque, como es amplio, grande, la mariposa cada que llega busca un lugar donde ella empiece a pasar lo que es el invierno. Pues es un animalito pequeño que viaja bastante y como es de que pues ahora sí que aguanta mucho el recorrido, tantos kilómetros. Pues nosotros, pues proteger el bosque, Más bien a mí me gustaría que pues ahora sí que los hijos y hasta pues tal vez hasta nietos, todo, puedan seguir aquí trabajando aquí en este centro turístico de la mariposa monarca.
So like the monarch butterfly, whose migratory journey spans 3 generations, valuable assets need to transcend the systems that they are in. The butterflies were not the ones who started the journey. You need to make sure that the asset's grandchild will be findable. You need to make sure that your grandchildren can find the assets. And with that, we are creating the archives of tomorrow. Thank you.